Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. You were sold a very comforting story. The West is decaying, China is rising, and somewhere between your overpriced electricity bill and your shrinking pension, a calm, technocratic superpower in the East will keep global growth going forever. The message is simple. Don't worry, the system is rigged, but at least it's rigged in favor of stability. The structural reality is much simpler and much less romantic. China is not a magic alternative planet. It is the most extreme version of the same growth model that broke the West. Debt, bubbles, over-leveraged real estate, demographic time bombs, just executed with better discipline and worse feedback. And by the mid-2020s, that model has hit the wall hard enough that even official statistics struggle to hide the cracks. Here's the first scale marker. Depending on how you count, China is around 1/5 of global output in purchasing power terms, and somewhere near 1/6 in nominal GDP. When a system that large slows, misallocates capital, or makes strategic mistakes, that doesn't stay in Beijing. It hits your factory orders in Germany, your container rates in Rotterdam, and your raw material prices from Africa to Latin America. And this is where the official story starts to fall apart, because the official story says, China is transitioning from investment and exports to consumption and innovation, smoothly, in an orderly fashion, with growth that somehow stays high, inflation low, and social stability untouched. In practice, what we see looks much more like a controlled emergency landing from an investment binge that went on at least a decade too long. Here's the part economists quietly fear. China's growth machine was built on three levers: cheap labor, massive construction, and expanding debt. By the mid-2020s, all three are exhausted or toxic. The labor force is shrinking, the construction sector is saturated, and the debt is reaching levels that make even Western central bankers raise an eyebrow and reach for a stress test model. If you take one thing from this, let it be this: China is not about to collapse, but the era where it could drag the rest of the world forward with double-digit growth is over. The system is now redistributing pain, internally, between regions and social groups, and externally, between trading partners and commodity suppliers. Let's unpack the mechanics without fairy tales. For roughly 4 decades, China ran an investment ratio that often hovered around 40% of GDP or more. That is not normal. That is not healthy dynamism. That is a permanent mobilization economy. Roads, bridges, factories, ports, whole new districts appearing where for a while there were just fields. It worked as long as 3 conditions held. Global markets were open, domestic labor was cheap and abundant, and the financial system could endlessly roll and expand credit. Structurally, this was never going to work forever. You can only urbanize a population once. You can only move hundreds of millions from farms to assembly lines one time. Once you've paved the land, built the apartment blocks, and saturated exports, the same investment produces less and less real return. And when returns fall, but the political system demands the same headline growth, you get the quiet poison of misallocation and bad debt. This is the flaw you can't fix with PR. Think of the property sector. At its peak, it accounted, directly and indirectly, for a huge share of China's GDP. A quarter or more if you add construction, materials, household spending tied to housing. Entire local budgets were fed not by productive industry, but by selling land to developers at ever higher prices. Households were trained to see apartments not as a place to live, but as the only reliable savings vehicle in a system where financial alternatives are tightly controlled. You see the problem here, right? If you let the bubble burst, households lose wealth, local governments lose revenue, banks face losses, and social stability gets shaky. If you don't let it burst, you zombify developers, freeze capital, and tie your financial system to concrete that nobody really needs. By the mid-2020s, Beijing is trying to split the difference, allowing some developers to fail, pushing unfinished projects to be completed, tightening speculation, but refusing a full reset that would realistically wipe out enormous paper wealth. So growth numbers are kept acceptable, but the engine underneath is grinding. From the outside, it still moves. From the inside, the gears are eating themselves. In short, the math doesn't care about ambition. Now add demographics. The working age population in China peaked years ago and is already declining. birth rates have fallen to levels comparable with or worse than many European countries. You have an aging society layered on top of a half-finished welfare state, with a pension system that was built on the assumption of endless growth and a constant inflow of young workers. Here's where the theory hits a brick wall. The old development model requires construction, exports, and debt expansion. The social reality requires more spending on health, pensions, and support for an aging population. These two logics are pulling in opposite directions. One wants more cement and steel. The other wants more doctors and carers. The financial capacity is not infinite. Something has to give. Energy and resources don't make it easier. China is a huge producer of coal and renewables, but it still imports vast quantities of oil, gas, food, and high-end components. Its industrial model depends on cheap and reliable flows of raw materials through maritime choke points that are, how to put it politely, not under Beijing's full control. If you're watching this from Europe, remember, when Chinese demand for energy and commodities fluctuates, your own prices tend to follow, with a lag. So let's take a breath. Where does this leave us so far? We have a growth model dependent on construction and debt, a demographic pyramid that looks more like a column, a property sector that is too big to fail and too rotten to save, and a resource position that depends on vulnerable trade lanes. And this brings us to the one number that changes the entire equation: the share of global manufacturing value added that China holds. It is enormous, roughly a third. When that system slows or shifts strategy, it doesn't just hit Chinese statistics. It rewires global supply chains, prices, and bargaining power. From an angle nobody likes to show you, China in the mid-2020s looks less like an unstoppable juggernaut and more like a heavily loaded tanker trying to change course in a narrow channel. It can be done, but it's slow, risky, and every wrong move leaves a very expensive dent in someone else's hull. Let's talk about incentives, because that's where the real story lives. Officially, Beijing talks about high-quality development, dual circulation, common prosperity, and security. In practice, this translates into a few hard imperatives: keep employment stable, prevent a financial crisis, reduce dependence on the dollar-centric system, and slowly move up the value chain in technology. If that sounds familiar, it's because every serious state wants the same. The difference is the starting position and the tools. Inside China, the leadership sits on a paradox. To keep people calm, they need growth, jobs, and some sense of upward mobility. But the easiest sources of growth, cheap labor, construction, external demand, are weakening. So they compensate with more state direction, more industrial policy, more security language, and more pressure on both private business and local officials to deliver without asking too many questions about long-term profitability. On paper, it's strategy. Up close, it looks much more like permanent crisis management, where every year, new programs, funds, and slogans are launched to plug the holes opened by the previous year's campaigns. The West, meanwhile, has its own incentives. For decades, it happily imported deflation from China. Cheap goods, low wages in supply chains, comfortable profit margins for corporations. That bargain created entire business models in Europe and North America that rely on Chinese factories functioning smoothly. At the same time, those same elites now talk about de-risking, strategic autonomy, and containing China's technological rise. They want cheap products without strategic dependence. They want access to the Chinese market while limiting Chinese access to their own. Here's where the story stops making sense. You cannot treat a country as your main manufacturing base and your main geopolitical rival at the same time without paying a price somewhere. Either you accept dependence and try to manage it, or you try to relocate supply chains and accept higher costs, disruption, and blowback. The fantasy that you can do both cleanly is just that, fantasy. If you're watching this from Germany, your reality is already different from someone in Portugal. German industry is deeply entangled with Chinese demand, especially in autos, machinery, and chemicals. When Chinese investment cycles slow, or when domestic Chinese producers start undercutting European brands in EVs and high-end equipment, that shows up in German order books, not just in conference speeches. From your corner of Europe, Does this look like strategy or managed decline with better PR? Now look at the neighbors. Southeast Asia is both a beneficiary and a hostage of China's trajectory. Some manufacturing is already moving to Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, trying to diversify risk and labor costs. But the capital, components, and markets are still tightly tied to China. China plus one is not a clean exit. It is a hedging strategy by corporates who want to whisper diversification to regulators while keeping margins based on Chinese scale. India wants to position itself as an alternative. Younger population, big market, strategic location. It does get some flows of investment and production, but it lacks China's infrastructure, coherence of industrial policy, and sheer speed of implementation from the earlier decades. It is not a plug-and-play replacement. It is a parallel bet. Russia, after the rupture with Europe, has drifted into the role of discount supplier of energy and raw materials to China. That gives Beijing leverage, but also adds another layer of risk. If Chinese growth slows, Russian volumes and prices feel it quickly. If you're in the Baltic region, this matters to you not in abstract geopolitical chess terms, but in very concrete flows of cargo, energy re-exports, and competition between ports. Let's zoom out for a second. From a distance, the picture becomes less comforting and more symmetrical. The Western model, built on financialization, services, and outsourcing, is exhausted. The Chinese model, built on construction, exports, and controlled finance, is also exhausted. Both are now trying to reinvent themselves on the fly while pretending to their citizens that nothing fundamental has changed. From here, all the options are bad. The only question is who pays first, and who pretends it's inevitable progress. Inside China, the payment starts with households. For years, they were encouraged to put almost all savings into property. Now, prices stagnate or decline in many areas, especially smaller cities. Youth unemployment has reached levels that the statistical agencies are clearly uncomfortable publishing consistently. Real wage growth is uneven, and the pressure to lie flat or quietly exit the rat race is spreading among the educated urban young. This is the moment when a development model stops being a heroic macro story and becomes a simple question. Can you find a decent job, pay for housing, raise a child, support your parents, and not drown in stress? For a growing share of Chinese families, the answer is barely or no. Here's where the experts in suits start sweating. Because a system that has promised rising living standards in exchange for political quiescence cannot indefinitely deliver stagnation and pressure without adjusting something fundamental. Either it relaxes control and tolerates more open debate and experimentation, or it tightens further and tries to micromanage not just the economy, but the emotions and narratives of an entire society. Recent years suggest the latter path is winning inside the apparatus. From an angle no one shows you, this starts to look very different. It's not a story of a confident rising power about to replace the West. It's a story of a state that knows its previous model is dying, is afraid of the social consequences of a shock reset, and is therefore stretching the transition over as many years as possible, even at the cost of lower productivity and simmering frustration. For Europe, especially small open economies around the Baltic, the consequences are less dramatic in television graphics and more painful in spreadsheets. If China grows slower, your export orders for machinery, chemicals, components soften. If China dumps excess production of green tech, steel, EVs or batteries onto world markets at low prices, your domestic producers suffocate, while your politicians give speeches about fair trade and quietly apply tariffs. If tension between China and the US escalates around technology, shipping, or finance, your logistics and energy prices feel the shockwaves first. This is the part no politician wants to explain on TV, because explaining it honestly means saying your bills, your job security, your rent, and your tax burden are now tied to the internal contradictions of a system thousands of kilometers away, run by people you didn't elect and cannot influence, and to the tantrums of people you did elect, but who don't control the plumbing of the global economy anymore. If you work in manufacturing or energy, you've seen this movie before. Overcapacity in one major region leads to dumping, trade disputes, retaliatory measures, uncertainty, and underinvestment elsewhere. The difference now is scale. When China adjusts its sails even slightly, everyone else's boat rocks. Does this hidden side make you question the whole narrative that China will save global growth, or that decoupling will be painless? It should. Let's bring it back to households and small businesses again, because systems are ultimately paid for by people, not by slogans. For Chinese SMEs, access to credit remains heavily distorted by state priorities. If you are linked to a favored sector, semiconductors, EVs, AI, green tech, you may get generous subsidies, loans, and policy support. If you run a normal business that just happens to be in the wrong sector or province, you live with uncertainty, shifting regulations, and banks that would rather park money in government-blessed vehicles than lend to you. For European SMEs, the picture mirrors this in a warped way. You are told to compete with Chinese producers who benefit from low-cost scale, coordinated policy, and, often, underpriced energy or credit. At the same time, your own regulators stack environmental, social, and reporting requirements on top of your operations, then act surprised when production leaves or margins vanish. This is where the theory of win-win cooperation hits a brick wall of invoices, payroll, and electricity bills. From this angle, does the official story still look convincing? Now, what about the financial dimension? China still holds large reserves, but the long-term trend is clear. It wants to reduce its exposure to dollar-centric vulnerabilities, expand the use of its own currency in trade, and build alternative payment channels. It is not about replacing the dollar overnight. That's fantasy. It's about having enough redundancy so that sanctions and financial pressure cannot crash the system. For the West, this is a direct challenge to one of the last uncontested levers of power: control over global finance and payment rails. You don't have to be a fan of any particular capital to see the structure. A manufacturing giant that is slowly trying to decouple its arteries from a financial system dominated by its main strategic rival. Here's the part economists quietly fear. A fragmented financial system with multiple competing blocks means higher frictions, more currency risk, and less ability to absorb shocks through coordinated responses. In simple language, more volatility for you, more risk for your savings, more instability for trade. If this actually surprises you, good. That's the part nobody bothers to show, because it doesn't fit into West good, China bad, or West collapsing, China rising comfort narratives. The truth is uglier. Both systems are running on inherited momentum, and both are structurally overextended. So where does this leave us, structurally, by the mid-2020s? China is not a savior of the global economy. It is a stressed core node in a network that is overheating at multiple points. Its leadership is trying to steer from construction debt export growth to something more sustainable, while maintaining tight political control. That combination is inherently unstable. Real reform wants experimentation, feedback, and tolerance for failure. Control wants predictability, obedience, and smooth headlines. The West is not a confident manager of the transition. It is a passenger that got used to cheap deflation from Chinese factories, hollowed out parts of its own industrial base, and now talks bravely about reshoring while quietly hoping that someone, somewhere, will keep the container ships full and the prices low. From the Baltic view, this looks less like a clash of civilizations and more like being stuck between two tired giants who both pretend they've got everything under control while shoving the bill downward. If you caught the hidden angle here, good. If not, the elites are already billing you anyway. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and try to remember, slogans don't power grids. Systems do.